There are characters who become controversial because audiences change. There are characters who become controversial because writers reinterpret them. And then there are the rare cases where a character becomes controversial because an institution spends decades teaching its audience how to see them. Mary Jane Watson belongs to that last category. Not because she was created as a divisive figure. Not because readers rejected her. Quite the opposite. Her story begins with a peculiar contradiction. Few comic book characters have been embraced so consistently across generations, adaptations, and cultural shifts, while simultaneously being treated with such persistent suspicion by the very system responsible for publishing them. That contradiction sits at the center of Spider-Man's modern history, like a fault line beneath a city. To understand the conflict, it helps to step back from individual stories and observe the larger territory. The Spider-Man myth was never merely about heroism. It was a narrative built around balance. A young man suspended between responsibility and desire, between public obligation and private longing, between the mask and the face beneath it. The famous costume, the swinging across rooftops, the endless battles against villains, those elements provided movement. But movement alone does not create gravity. Every enduring myth requires a center, a place the hero returns to, a foundation capable of giving meaning to the struggle. For a surprising amount of Spider-Man's history, Mary Jane became that foundation. Not immediately, not in the beginning. At first she arrived almost like a disruption, a burst of color entering a world defined by anxiety. Peter Parker occupied a narrative landscape crowded with guilt, insecurity, obligation, and loss. Mary Jane represented something different. She embodied motion without fear, social confidence without cruelty, freedom without detachment. She was not introduced as a reward waiting at the end of a heroic journey. She functioned more like a challenge to Peter's worldview, an invitation to imagine that life might contain joy alongside responsibility. That distinction matters, because the central question of this story is not whether Peter Parker and Mary Jane should be together. That debate has consumed fandom for decades, often obscuring the deeper issue beneath it. The real question is stranger. Why would a fictional institution repeatedly undermine one of its most successful relationships, even while audiences continue trying to restore it? Why does the narrative keep moving toward separation, while nearly every adaptation outside the comics keeps moving toward reunion? Why does one version of the myth keep rejecting something that every other version instinctively rebuilds? The answer may have less to do with romance than with memory. Comic books are unusual cultural ecosystems. Unlike novels, they rarely belong to a single generation. They persist for decades. Editors become readers before becoming editors. Writers inherit stories that shaped them as children. Entire creative departments emerge from the audience itself. Under those conditions, old emotional experiences do not disappear. They accumulate. They settle into the foundations. They become invisible assumptions about what the story is supposed to be. Sometimes those assumptions become stronger than the story itself. The death of Gwen Stacy cast a shadow across Spider-Man's mythology, unlike almost any event in superhero fiction. It was shocking, tragic, transformative. It marked the end of an era and redefined what mainstream comics believed they could do. Yet cultural traumas rarely remain frozen in their original form. They continue moving through institutions long after the event itself has passed. The people who experience them grow older. Their interpretations harden. Their emotional responses become part of the architecture. And architecture shapes everything built upon it. Seen from that perspective, Mary Jane begins to resemble something more than a character. She becomes contested territory, a symbolic frontier between competing visions of what Spider-Man is supposed to represent. On one side stands the possibility of growth, stability, maturity, and permanence. On the other stands the belief that Spider-Man must remain suspended within perpetual incompletion, forever circling the emotional conditions that first made him recognizable. Neither side describes itself that way, of course. Conflicts this old rarely do. Instead, the struggle emerges through editorial mandates, narrative resets, relationship breakdowns, rewritten histories, and recurring attempts to return Peter Parker to an earlier state. Yet beneath those decisions lies a deeper tension, a conflict between memory and development, between preservation and evolution, between a myth seeking expansion and a system seeking containment. This is why Mary Jane's history feels so unusual. Most fictional characters rise or fall according to audience demand. Her story operates according to a different logic. The more the narrative attempts to push her away, the more adaptations seem compelled to bring her back. Films do it. Television does it. Video games do it. Alternate universes do it. Again and again, different creators approach Spider-Man's world and arrive at remarkably similar conclusions, as though they are rediscovering a foundation buried beneath decades of construction. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the controversy surrounding Mary Jane was never primarily about Mary Jane at all. Perhaps it reveals something about the people managing the myth, about the emotional inheritance they received, about the stories they believe they are protecting, about the invisible gravity exerted by a loss that occurred decades ago and never truly stopped echoing through the walls of Marvel's most important franchise. Because sometimes the most revealing character in a story is not the one standing under the spotlight. Sometimes it is the one the spotlight keeps trying to avoid. Before Mary Jane Watson became a point of controversy, she occupied a very different position within the Spider-Man myth. She was not originally conceived as a disruption to the narrative. She was not introduced as a problem requiring correction. In many ways, she emerged as the natural consequence of Spider-Man's own evolution. The franchise had spent years constructing a protagonist defined by tension, insecurity, responsibility, and emotional burden. Peter Parker existed within a world where every gain seemed attached to a corresponding loss. His victories rarely felt complete because the narrative itself was organized around pressure. Yet a character cannot remain under increasing pressure forever without eventually forcing the story to answer a larger question. What is all this struggle for? What kind of life is waiting on the other side of responsibility? Mary Jane arrived precisely where that question began to matter. The cultural environment that produced Spider-Man is important because it reveals the assumptions hidden beneath the character's popularity. Peter Parker was revolutionary not because he was powerful, but because he was vulnerable. Earlier superheroes often occupied symbolic heights above ordinary life. Spider-Man was trapped inside ordinary life. Bills had to be paid. Relationships had to be maintained. Mistakes carried consequences. Social rejection mattered. Personal failure mattered. The mask gave him extraordinary abilities, but it did not protect him from anxiety, self-doubt, or guilt. In fact, those forces became the engine driving the entire franchise. Spider-Man was never fundamentally a fantasy of power. He was a fantasy of endurance, the ability to keep moving despite overwhelming emotional weight. This structure created one of the most recognizable psychological landscapes in modern fiction. Peter Parker became a character whose identity was built around obligation. Every important event in his life reinforced that pattern. The death of Uncle Ben transformed responsibility into a moral foundation. Heroism became inseparable from sacrifice. Success became inseparable from loss. The narrative repeatedly taught both Peter and the audience that meaningful action demanded payment. Over time, this produced an unusual effect. Suffering ceased to function merely as an obstacle. It became part of the franchise's emotional language. The reader learned to expect it. The character learned to carry it. The myth itself began organizing around it. Then came Gwen Stacy, and with her came one of the most influential tragedies in comic book history. Yet the significance of Gwen's death extends beyond the event itself. The death mattered because of what happened afterward. A living character continues evolving. A dead character becomes symbolic. Every future interpretation becomes filtered through absence. Contradictions disappear. Flaws soften. Complexity gradually yields to idealization. The individual becomes a monument. Over the decades, Gwen Stacy increasingly occupied that space within Spider-Man mythology. She ceased being merely a former love interest and became a representation of something lost forever. Not simply for Peter Parker, but for the audience itself. What makes this especially important is the generational nature of comic books. Unlike most forms of storytelling, superhero comics create an unusual continuity between creators and consumers. Readers become writers. Fans become editors. Children grow into custodians of the stories that shape them. Under these conditions, emotional experiences do not disappear when the audience ages. They become institutional memory. The feelings attached to certain stories remain embedded within the culture of the franchise itself. The people making decisions decades later are often responding not only to the narrative they inherited, but to the emotional impact that narrative had on them when they first encountered it. Mary Jane Watson emerged from an entirely different symbolic direction. Where Gwen increasingly became associated with memory, Mary Jane became associated with movement. Her earliest appearances projected confidence, spontaneity, and social ease. Yet the character's enduring success did not come from surface-level charisma. It came from the gradual revelation that her confidence was itself a performance. Beneath the humor, glamour, and apparent fearlessness existed a person carrying insecurities every bit as real as Peter Parker's. The difference was not the presence of pain. The difference was the strategy used to survive it. Peter retreated inward. Mary Jane moved outward. Peter concealed himself through caution. Mary Jane concealed herself through performance. Both were wearing masks long before superhero costumes entered the equation. This is why their relationship proved more durable than many readers initially expected. Popular discussions often frame successful fictional romances through the language of opposites attracting. Peter and Mary Jane were not truly opposites. They were reflections. Both understood loneliness. Both understood fear. Both understood the exhausting labor of presenting a version of themselves to the world while protecting something more vulnerable underneath. Their emotional compatibility emerged from recognition rather than contrast. Each character saw truth in the other that most people overlooked. The relationship worked because it allowed both individuals to stop performing quite so much. As the years progressed, this dynamic transformed Mary Jane's role within the franchise. She stopped functioning as a supporting character orbiting the protagonist. Instead, she became part of the emotional architecture supporting the entire narrative. Peter Parker's life could not simply accumulate responsibility forever. At some point, responsibility required purpose. It required connection. It required a future. Mary Jane increasingly occupied that future. She represented the possibility that growth was not only possible, but meaningful. The endless struggle could actually lead somewhere. The burden could produce stability. The chaos could produce a home. This development coincided with a broader transformation occurring throughout superhero comics during the 1980s and 1990s. Characters across the medium were aging, evolving, and accumulating history. Readers who had grown up with these heroes were themselves entering adulthood. Marriage, careers, and long-term commitments no longer felt incompatible with the audience's expectations. In that environment, Peter Parker and Mary Jane's relationship did not appear radical. It appeared natural. The franchise seemed to be following the trajectory its own internal logic had established. The young man defined by uncertainty was gradually becoming an adult capable of building something lasting. Yet permanence introduces a unique form of anxiety within serialized storytelling. Every long-running franchise eventually confronts a conflict between evolution and preservation. Growth creates narrative possibilities, but it also threatens familiar identities. The more a character changes, the more distant they become from the version that originally achieved cultural success. Publishers often attempt to resolve this tension by balancing progression with recognizability. Spider-Man's situation proved unusually difficult because Mary Jane was not merely part of Peter's development. She became one of its clearest symbols. Her presence suggested that the story could move forward. Her importance implied that emotional maturity was not temporary. Her relationship with Peter challenged the assumption that the character's defining state should remain permanent uncertainty. In practical terms, this transformed Mary Jane into something larger than a romantic partner. She became a symbolic frontier separating two competing visions of Spider-Man. One vision treated growth as the reward earned through experience. The other treated growth as a potential threat to the franchise's foundational identity. This tension becomes impossible to ignore when examining adaptations beyond the comics themselves. Again and again, creators working in film, television, animation, and video games arrive at remarkably similar conclusions regarding Peter and Mary Jane. Different creative teams operating under different circumstances repeatedly reconstruct the relationship because it solves a problem embedded within the mythology. Spider-Man requires pressure, but pressure alone cannot sustain meaning. A story built entirely around suffering eventually begins collapsing inward. It needs counterbalance. It needs emotional gravity pulling the protagonist towards something beyond survival. Mary Jane consistently fulfills that function. By the time the modern era of Spider-Man editorial philosophy emerged, the conflict was no longer really about romance. Romance was simply the visible surface of a deeper disagreement. Beneath every debate about Mary Jane existed a more fundamental question about the nature of the franchise itself. Was Spider-Man a story about becoming, or was it a story about remaining? Was Peter Parker supposed to build upon his experiences, or endlessly circle them? Could the hero grow older without losing his identity? Could happiness coexist with relatability? The answers to those questions would eventually shape decades of storytelling decisions. More importantly, they would transform Mary Jane Watson from a beloved character into the symbolic center of one of the longest-running ideological conflicts in superhero comics. The fracture did not appear overnight. That is what makes the history of Mary Jane Watson so revealing. Most famous conflicts in comic books arrive dramatically. A shocking death, a controversial storyline, a creative reboot, a public editorial decision. The conflict surrounding Mary Jane emerged differently. It developed gradually, almost invisibly, through a series of small narrative choices that only reveal their larger pattern when viewed across decades. Individual stories seemed isolated. Individual editorial decisions appeared temporary. Yet taken together they formed a coherent movement. The center of gravity was shifting. What had once been treated as a natural destination for Peter Parker was increasingly being reframed as an obstacle to the version of Spider-Man certain decision-makers wished to preserve. The irony is difficult to ignore because the relationship itself had already survived the test most fictional romances fail. Longevity. Popular culture is filled with couples who generate excitement during courtship only to become dramatically less interesting once commitment arrives. Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson proved remarkably resistant to that problem. Writers found new tensions to explore. New forms of intimacy emerged. New conflicts appeared that were rooted not in romantic uncertainty, but in the challenge of maintaining a shared life under extraordinary circumstances. The relationship did not eliminate drama. It transformed its nature. Instead of asking whether two people should be together, the stories began asking what it actually means to remain together. That distinction represented a form of maturation rarely seen in superhero comics. Peter Parker's world had always been defined by instability. Relationships collapsed, friendships fractured, employment disappeared, financial problems returned, villains escaped. Every victory remained temporary. Against that backdrop, Mary Jane increasingly functioned as one of the few constants capable of resisting the chaos. She was not a reward waiting at the end of struggle. She was evidence that struggle had produced something meaningful. Her presence suggested that growth was possible without abandoning the character's identity. Yet permanence often creates anxiety inside serialized narratives. Stability may be psychologically satisfying, but it introduces complications for institutions dependent upon repetition. Every successful franchise develops a recognizable emotional rhythm. Audiences return because certain experiences remain familiar. Spider-Man's rhythm had long been organized around uncertainty. Peter Parker struggled. Peter Parker lost something important. Peter Parker endured. Then the cycle began again. Marriage complicated that rhythm because it altered the emotional landscape surrounding the character. The struggle remained, but it no longer existed in isolation. The hero now belonged to a larger structure. His victories and failures affected someone else. The narrative center expanded. For readers who had followed Peter Parker for years, this expansion often felt earned. The character was no longer a teenager navigating first romances and early disappointments. He was an adult carrying decades of accumulated experience. The relationship with Mary Jane reflected that history. It acknowledged the passage of time rather than pretending it had not occurred. In many ways, the marriage represented one of the most successful examples of long-term character development in mainstream superhero comics. It demonstrated that evolution did not necessarily destroy recognizability. Peter Parker remained Peter Parker. He simply became a more complete version of himself. This is where the deeper disagreement begins to emerge. Beneath debates about storytelling, accessibility, and audience expectations existed a conflict over the meaning of Spider-Man itself. One interpretation viewed the character as fundamentally developmental. Peter Parker faced adversity in order to become something. Experience mattered because it accumulated. Relationships mattered because they transformed him. Time mattered because growth required duration. The alternative interpretation viewed the character through a different lens. Spider-Man was not moving toward adulthood. Spider-Man was adulthood deferred. The perpetual state of becoming was itself the destination. Stability risked undermining the essential emotional condition that made the character relatable. Neither perspective was inherently irrational. The problem was that they pointed toward incompatible futures. As the years progressed, evidence of this tension began appearing more frequently within the comics themselves. Stories increasingly treated Peter and Mary Jane's relationship not as a foundation, but as a variable. Separation became a recurring narrative tool. Commitment became something that required constant justification. Moments of happiness often carried an invisible expiration date. The relationship could survive individual conflicts, but it increasingly felt as though the larger system surrounding it remained unconvinced of its legitimacy. What had once been accepted as part of Spider-Man's evolution was gradually being repositioned as a problem requiring management. The most revealing aspect of this process was not the stories themselves, but the assumptions beneath them. Again and again, discussions surrounding Spider-Man returned to a familiar idea. Peter Parker needed to be relatable. Peter Parker needed to remain accessible. Peter Parker needed to reflect youthful uncertainty. Yet these arguments contained a hidden contradiction. Millions of readers grow older. Millions of readers enter long-term relationships. Millions of readers build careers, families, and commitments. Why should maturity be less relatable than adolescence? Why should development create distance rather than recognition? The answer appears to lie in a particular understanding of nostalgia. Nostalgia is rarely a longing for the past as it actually existed. It is a longing for the emotional experience associated with the past. Certain versions of Spider-Man became culturally powerful because they captured specific feelings: isolation, aspiration, romantic uncertainty, economic instability. The challenge emerges when preserving those feelings requires preventing the character from escaping them. What begins as affection for a particular era can gradually transform into resistance against change itself. Mary Jane occupied the center of that contradiction. Her continued presence challenged the assumption that Spider-Man's most important stories had already happened. She represented the possibility that the character's future could matter as much as his past. Every successful depiction of the relationship implicitly argued that growth need not erase identity. Peter Parker could remain recognizable while still moving forward. He could preserve the emotional core of the character without preserving every circumstance surrounding that core. This is why the conflict eventually transcended ordinary creative disagreements. Mary Jane was no longer functioning solely as a fictional person. She had become symbolic territory. Different visions of Spider-Man were competing for control of the same narrative space. One side viewed her as evidence of successful development. The other viewed her as evidence that the character had drifted too far from his original condition. Every story involving the relationship gradually acquired significance beyond its immediate plot because it was participating in a larger argument about what the franchise should become. What makes the situation especially unusual is how consistently other adaptations arrived at different conclusions. While portions of the comic book line increasingly treated Peter and Mary Jane's relationship as problematic, film directors, television writers, game developers, and alternate universe creators repeatedly restored it. They did not do so because they were collaborating with one another. They did so because the underlying narrative logic remained visible. When creators approached Spider-Man from outside the editorial traditions of the main comics continuity, many naturally gravitated toward the same emotional architecture that earlier writers had helped establish. That recurring pattern suggests something important. The conflict was never simply a disagreement between fans and creators, nor was it merely a dispute about romantic preference. It reflected a deeper struggle between two competing understandings of continuity itself. One treated continuity as a road. The other treated continuity as a circle. One believed the accumulated history of a character should lead somewhere. The other believed the accumulated history existed primarily to maintain a familiar emotional state. By the end of this period, the fracture could no longer remain invisible. Too many stories had reinforced it. Too many assumptions had hardened around it. The relationship that once symbolized Peter Parker's growth was now being asked to justify its existence over and over again. The question was no longer whether Peter and Mary Jane worked together as characters. Decades of storytelling had already answered that. The real question was whether Spider-Man himself would be allowed to evolve into the future that relationship implied. The answer would reshape the franchise for years to come. The decisive transformation occurred when the conflict surrounding Mary Jane Watson ceased to function as a narrative disagreement and gradually evolved into an ideological one. For years, the tension remained largely invisible to casual readers because it was expressed through isolated editorial choices rather than explicit declarations. Individual stories could be interpreted as temporary detours, creative experiments, or ordinary shifts in direction. Yet when those stories are examined collectively, a remarkably consistent pattern begins to emerge. The relationship itself was rarely treated as inherently flawed. In fact, its longevity often demonstrated the opposite. The growing discomfort seemed directed not toward what the relationship was, but toward what it represented within the larger architecture of Spider-Man. This distinction reveals the true nature of the conflict. Successful stories eventually create a challenge that many long-running franchises struggle to resolve. Conflict generates movement, but resolution generates transformation. When a narrative spends decades allowing experiences to accumulate and characters to evolve, audiences begin to expect that evolution to matter. Peter Parker's relationship with Mary Jane embodied exactly that expectation. Their history was not built upon temporary attraction or superficial chemistry. It emerged through years of shared experiences, emotional sacrifices, personal losses, and mutual growth. The relationship suggested that responsibility could eventually produce stability rather than endless suffering. For many readers, that progression felt like the natural destination of the character's journey. For others, it appeared increasingly incompatible with the emotional condition they associated with Spider-Man. As this divide widened, Mary Jane's symbolic role began to shift. Earlier eras of Spider-Man frequently positioned her as one of the few forces capable of balancing the immense pressure that defined Peter Parker's life. She functioned as emotional counterweight within a world structured around anxiety, guilt, and obligation. Her presence did not eliminate conflict. Rather, it transformed conflict into something more complex and mature. Peter Parker still struggled, but those struggles now existed within the context of a meaningful relationship. The narrative no longer revolved exclusively around survival. It began exploring what could be built despite the chaos. Yet over time, the very qualities that once represented growth increasingly became sources of editorial discomfort. Stability began appearing less like achievement and more like limitation. Commitment began appearing less like maturity and more like restriction. The irony embedded within this transformation is difficult to overlook. Peter Parker and Mary Jane had already survived the challenge that destroys many fictional romances. They remained compelling after uncertainty disappeared. Their stories continued generating tension, because tension did not depend upon whether they would remain together. It depended upon how they navigated extraordinary circumstances together. This distinction fundamentally altered the emotional structure of the franchise. Instead of asking whether love was possible, the narrative began exploring what maintaining love actually required. That is a different kind of storytelling. It is less concerned with pursuit and more concerned with endurance. It replaces fantasy with construction. It shifts attention away from desire and toward responsibility. Yet maintenance creates a unique problem within serialized fiction. Pursuit is infinitely repeatable. Construction is not. A story built around uncertainty can endlessly recreate familiar emotional rhythms. A story built around growth must continually move forward or risk stagnation. This placed Spider-Man in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Peter Parker's accumulated history was pointing toward adulthood, while certain editorial instincts remained attached to perpetual adolescence. The relationship with Mary Jane became the most visible manifestation of this contradiction because it embodied everything that separated those two visions. It represented continuity. It represented consequence. It represented the idea that experiences should leave permanent marks on a person's life. What gradually emerged was a conflict between two fundamentally different understandings of continuity itself. One perspective treated continuity as a road. Experiences accumulated, lessons mattered, and relationships transformed the people involved. The alternative perspective treated continuity more like a circle. Events occurred, lessons were learned, but the character ultimately returned to a familiar emotional position. Neither approach is inherently illegitimate. Both have produced successful stories across different genres and mediums. The difficulty arises when a single franchise attempts to pursue both directions simultaneously. The resulting tension often manifests through contradictions reversals, and recurring efforts to reconcile incompatible goals. Mary Jane found herself positioned directly at the center of this contradiction. She was not merely participating in Peter Parker's development. She had become one of its clearest symbols. Her continued presence reinforced the notion that Spider-Man's history mattered. Every year spent together strengthened the idea that growth could become permanent. Every shared hardship reinforced the notion that maturity need not diminish relatability. In many ways, she represented the accumulated weight of the franchise's own past. Removing that weight would not simply alter a relationship. It would alter the trajectory that relationship implied. It would redefine the meaning of everything that came before it. This is where the conflict begins revealing deeper psychological dimensions. Institutions often become attached not merely to stories, but to particular emotional interpretations of those stories. Spider-Man's early popularity emerged from a powerful combination of insecurity, aspiration, and struggle. Those feelings resonated with generations of readers because they reflected universal experiences. The challenge is that emotional identification can gradually harden into orthodoxy. What begins as appreciation for a character's origins can evolve into resistance against anything that moves beyond those origins. The emotional conditions that once generated growth become conditions that must be endlessly preserved. Development itself begins appearing suspicious because it threatens a familiar source of identification. Viewed from this perspective, many editorial decisions start resembling attempts to preserve an emotional atmosphere rather than a coherent narrative trajectory. The objective was not necessarily to harm Mary Jane as a character. The objective was to restore a particular version of Spider-Man. Yet because Mary Jane represented a future that version could never fully accommodate, she inevitably became a target of the restoration process. The relationship did not need to fail because it was broken. It needed to fail because it contradicted the desired destination. Its success had become incompatible with the emotional framework certain decision-makers wished to maintain. The remarkable aspect of this process is how differently it unfolded outside the primary comics continuity. Film adaptations, animated series, video games, and alternate universes repeatedly gravitated toward Peter and Mary Jane's relationship. Different creators working in different mediums often arrived at similar conclusions despite operating under entirely different constraints. This recurring pattern suggests that something within the underlying mythology continued pulling creators toward the relationship. When separated from decades of accumulated editorial assumptions, many storytellers seem to recognize Mary Jane's role not as an obstacle to Spider-Man, but as a natural extension of his evolution. That recurring instinct highlights the growing divide between institutional memory and narrative logic. Institutional memory was increasingly focused on preserving a particular emotional image of Spider-Man. Narrative logic continued pointing toward growth, continuity, and maturation. Mary Jane occupied the fault line separating those positions. Every story involving her acquired significance beyond its immediate plot because it was participating in a larger argument about the purpose of the franchise itself. The relationship became symbolic territory. Different visions of Spider-Man were competing for control of the same narrative landscape, and every creative decision pushed the conflict further toward inevitability. By this stage, the disagreement could no longer be understood as a simple debate about romance. Romance was merely the visible surface of a deeper ideological struggle. The real conflict concerned authorship, continuity, and the meaning of development within serialized fiction. It concerned whether Spider-Man's history existed to build a future or merely to sustain a present. It concerned whether growth should be treated as fulfillment or as deviation. Most importantly, it concerned who ultimately possessed the authority to define the character's trajectory. The institution publishing the stories, the creators writing them, or the audience carrying them across generations. As these competing forces collided, Mary Jane Watson ceased being merely a character within Spider-Man's world. She became the arena in which the franchise's most important philosophical battle was being fought. The most revealing stage of this conflict begins when the relationship itself ceases to be the primary subject. By this point, the debate surrounding Mary Jane Watson is no longer really about whether she belongs with Peter Parker. Decades of stories have already provided that answer repeatedly. The more interesting question is why the answer continues being challenged despite the consistency with which it reappears. When a narrative keeps arriving at the same destination across different eras, different creative teams, and different adaptations, the persistence of that destination becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Something deeper is operating beneath the surface. The conflict is no longer between two fictional characters. It is between two competing understandings of what Spider-Man fundamentally is. One of the most unusual aspects of Mary Jane's history is that her position within the mythology remains remarkably stable whenever the character is interpreted outside the gravitational pull of mainline editorial continuity. Filmmakers arrive at her. Television writers arrive at her. Video game developers arrive at her. Alternate universes repeatedly arrive at her. The specifics may differ. The details may change. Certain adaptations merge aspects of Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane. Others reinvent her background entirely. Yet the underlying narrative function remains strikingly recognizable. She consistently emerges as the person most capable of seeing Peter Parker rather than merely Spider-Man. She becomes the emotional center toward which the character naturally gravitates. She represents continuity in a world defined by fragmentation. This recurring pattern matters because it exposes the difference between organic narrative development and institutional preference. Organic narrative development follows the internal logic of a story. Characters evolve according to their experiences. Relationships deepen according to shared history. Consequences accumulate. Institutional preference operates according to different concerns. Brand identity, market positioning, accessibility, the maintenance of familiar emotional conditions. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but they often produce very different outcomes. The tension surrounding Mary Jane becomes fascinating because it reveals what happens when those outcomes collide repeatedly over the course of several decades. At the center of this collision sits a peculiar contradiction. Spider-Man is often described as the most relatable superhero in comics. That relatability is frequently invoked as justification for keeping Peter Parker trapped within a state of recurring instability. Yet relatability is not a fixed category. Readers age. Audiences mature. The concerns that dominate a person's life at 16 are rarely identical to the concerns that dominate their life at 30, 40, or 50. Relationships become more complex. Responsibilities expand. Long-term commitments replace short-term uncertainties. If relatability genuinely means reflecting human experience, then maturation should increase a character's relevance rather than diminish it. The resistance to Peter Parker's growth, therefore, reveals an underlying assumption. What is being preserved is not relatability itself. It is a specific version of relatability associated with a particular stage of life. Mary Jane consistently disrupts that assumption because she transforms Peter Parker's struggles rather than eliminating them. This is a crucial distinction that often disappears from discussions about the character. Critics of the relationship frequently frame stability as the absence of conflict. Yet Peter Parker's life never becomes easier because Mary Jane exists. Villains continue attacking. Financial pressures continue accumulating. Personal failures continue occurring. The burden of responsibility remains intact. What changes is the context within which those challenges occur. The character is no longer confronting them alone. The struggle evolves from individual survival into shared endurance. The narrative moves from isolation toward partnership. For some readers and creators, that evolution represents growth. For others, it appears to dilute the emotional formula associated with classic Spider-Man. The resulting conflict gradually reshapes the perception of Mary Jane herself. Once a character becomes associated with a broader ideological disagreement, objective evaluation becomes increasingly difficult. Every appearance begins carrying symbolic weight beyond the immediate story. Supporters view her as evidence of development. Critics view her as evidence of deviation. The character becomes a screen onto which competing groups project larger anxieties about the franchise. This process is common within cultural institutions, but it rarely unfolds with such visibility. Most fictional characters do not spend decades functioning as symbolic territory within an ongoing struggle over narrative identity. The psychological dimensions of this phenomenon become even more interesting when viewed through the lens of memory. Memory is not a passive archive. It is an active force. It reorganizes events. It emphasizes certain experiences while minimizing others. It transforms complex histories into emotionally coherent narratives. Gwen Stacy occupies a unique position within Spider-Man mythology because her death became one of the defining memories of the franchise. Entire generations of readers experienced that event as a formative emotional moment. Over time, the memory of Gwen's death accumulated symbolic significance far beyond the original story itself. It became associated with innocence lost, tragedy, permanence, and emotional impact. Those associations did not remain confined to the audience. They gradually became embedded within the institutional culture surrounding Spider-Man. This creates a fascinating possibility. The persistent resistance to Mary Jane may not originate from hostility toward the character herself. It may originate from loyalty toward a particular emotional memory. If Gwen Stacy's death represents one of the defining tragedies of Spider-Man's history, then any development that appears to move beyond that tragedy risks feeling like a form of betrayal. The narrative wound becomes sacred. The character's growth begins threatening the emotional significance attached to the loss. Under those conditions, preserving the wound can become more important than healing it. The tragedy ceases to be part of the story and becomes one of the structures organizing the story. Whether this interpretation fully explains the situation is ultimately less important than what it reveals about the nature of long-running myths. Myths do not belong entirely to their creators. They do not belong entirely to their audiences either. They exist within a constantly shifting space between the two. Every generation inherits them. Every generation reinterprets them. Every generation attempts to decide which elements are essential and which are expendable. The conflict surrounding Mary Jane Watson exposes that process with unusual clarity because it forces a confrontation between inheritance and evolution. The franchise must continually choose whether it wishes to preserve a memory or continue a journey. This is why attempts to marginalize Mary Jane often produce results opposite to those intended. The more aggressively the narrative attempts to separate her from Peter Parker, the more clearly her symbolic role becomes visible. Readers begin noticing what is missing. They begin examining why it is missing. They begin recognizing how much of Spider-Man's emotional architecture had become connected to her presence over the decades. What might once have been interpreted as an ordinary relationship increasingly appears as one of the central foundations supporting the modern myth. Efforts to weaken that foundation frequently end up revealing its importance instead. By the time the conflict reaches this stage, it can no longer be resolved through individual stories. The disagreement has become structural. Every new writer inherits it. Every new editor inherits it. Every new adaptation inherits it. The question remains the same, even as the circumstances change. Is Spider-Man a character defined by perpetual incompletion, or is he a character whose experiences are allowed to accumulate into something larger? Mary Jane Watson remains at the center of that question because she represents the possibility that growth is not only achievable but meaningful. She stands as evidence that the journey can produce a destination without losing its identity along the way. And that possibility may be precisely what makes her one of the most controversial characters in superhero comics. Not because audiences rejected her, not because the stories failed, but because her existence continues forcing the franchise to confront a question it has never fully answered. Whether the purpose of continuity is to preserve the past or to allow the future to exist. At this point, the discussion can no longer be contained within the boundaries of Spider-Man comics. The conflict surrounding Mary Jane Watson ceased being a dispute about a fictional relationship years ago. What makes the situation remarkable is not the relationship itself, but the cultural machinery that formed around it. Few comic book characters have spent decades occupying such a strange position within popular culture. On one hand, she remains one of the most recognizable and beloved supporting characters in superhero fiction. On the other, she has repeatedly been treated by portions of the publishing apparatus as though her importance requires constant justification. The resulting tension transformed her from a character into a cultural symbol, and symbols inevitably reveal far more about the people interpreting them than about themselves. One of the most fascinating aspects of long-running fiction is the way audiences form emotional ownership over stories. Readers do not merely consume narratives, they internalize them. Certain characters become attached to specific periods of life, specific memories, and specific emotional experiences. Over time, those attachments create communities organized around shared interpretations of what a story means. Spider-Man possesses one of the largest and most emotionally invested communities in comic book history. The character has existed long enough for multiple generations to inherit him under entirely different circumstances. Each generation encounters a different version of Peter Parker. Each generation develops a different understanding of what the character represents. The conflict surrounding Mary Jane exposes the friction that emerges when those understandings collide. What makes her case particularly unusual is that she occupies a position where audience memory and institutional memory frequently move in opposite directions. For many readers, Mary Jane became inseparable from Peter Parker's emotional development. She represented growth, continuity, and shared history. For certain editorial traditions, however, she increasingly became associated with limitations imposed upon the franchise. This divergence created a situation where the same character could simultaneously function as a symbol of progress and a symbol of restriction, depending upon who was interpreting her. The disagreement was never really about Mary Jane herself. It was about what kind of Spider-Man people wished to preserve. This dynamic resembles a struggle over territory. Not physical territory, but symbolic territory. Every major myth develops a center, a location where competing interpretations gather and confront one another. In the Spider-Man myth, Mary Jane gradually became one of those locations. Readers defending her were often defending a broader philosophy regarding continuity, consequence, and maturation. Those opposing her role were often defending a different philosophy centered around accessibility, flexibility, and perpetual renewal. Neither side was merely arguing about romance. They were arguing about the future direction of the myth itself. The persistence of this conflict reveals something important about the nature of superhero storytelling. Most fictional narratives are allowed to end. Their themes can evolve because their structures are finite. Superhero comics occupy a different cultural space. They are designed to continue indefinitely. This creates a permanent tension between movement and preservation. Characters must change enough to remain interesting while remaining recognizable enough to maintain their identities. Every franchise develops its own strategy for managing this contradiction. Spider-Man's strategy became increasingly centered around preserving a specific emotional atmosphere. Mary Jane's continued importance challenged that atmosphere because she suggested that movement could be permanent rather than temporary. The reactions generated by this tension reveal how deeply people invest in fictional systems. Readers who support Peter and Mary Jane are often accused of being attached to nostalgia. Yet nostalgia operates on both sides of the debate. One group longs for the accumulated history of the relationship. The other longs for the emotional uncertainty associated with an earlier version of Spider-Man. Both positions are shaped by memory. Both are attempting to preserve something emotionally meaningful. The difference lies in what they believe deserves preservation. One side prioritizes the journey. The other prioritizes the starting point. This is where the role of adaptation becomes particularly revealing. Adaptations function like cultural experiments. They remove characters from one environment and place them within another. When this process occurs repeatedly across multiple mediums, recurring patterns become difficult to ignore. Again and again, creators working outside the primary comics continuity reconstruct Peter Parker's connection with Mary Jane. Sometimes they alter details. Sometimes they reinvent circumstances. Sometimes they merge characteristics from different eras of the mythology. Yet the relationship itself repeatedly reemerges. This recurrence suggests that Mary Jane fulfills a narrative function deeper than any individual storyline. She answers a structural need embedded within the myth. That structural need concerns balance. Spider-Man's world is defined by pressure. Responsibility creates pressure. Guilt creates pressure. Heroism creates pressure. Failure creates pressure. Without some form of counterweight, the narrative risks becoming emotionally one-dimensional. Mary Jane frequently serves as that counterweight. She does not eliminate suffering. She contextualizes it. She provides a center around which chaos can orbit. In symbolic terms, she functions less like a destination and more like a foundation. The hero's struggle acquires meaning because there is something worth protecting beyond the struggle itself. The cultural significance of this role becomes clearer when examining audience reactions to attempts at removing it. When institutions successfully eliminate unpopular characters, audiences generally move on. Interest fades. Discussion diminishes. The character becomes a footnote. Mary Jane produced the opposite response. Every major effort to distance her from Peter Parker generated years of debate, criticism, and renewed investment. Rather than disappearing, her symbolic importance grew. The conflict itself amplified her visibility. Attempts to reduce her significance often reinforced it, because they drew attention to how central she had become within the emotional architecture of the franchise. This amplification reflects a broader phenomenon within modern fandom. Contemporary audiences do not merely consume stories. They participate in ongoing conversations about those stories. Social media, forums, video essays, and online communities transform interpretation into a collective activity. Under these conditions, every editorial decision becomes subject to scrutiny. Every narrative choice generates discussion. Characters become symbols around which communities organize themselves. Mary Jane evolved into precisely that kind of symbol. Debates about her often function as proxies for larger debates concerning continuity, character development, and institutional authority. The result is that Mary Jane Watson occupies a uniquely paradoxical position within superhero culture. Few supporting characters have been subjected to such sustained efforts at narrative marginalization, while simultaneously remaining so culturally resilient. Few characters have inspired such persistent attempts at removal, while repeatedly reappearing across adaptations, alternate universes, and audience preferences. The contradiction is so pronounced that it almost ceases to be a contradiction. Instead, it begins resembling evidence. evidence that certain elements of a myth persist because they satisfy needs deeper than editorial preference. Ultimately, the significance of Mary Jane's story extends beyond Spider-Man entirely. It reveals how modern myths are negotiated between creators, institutions, and audiences. It reveals how memory shapes interpretation. It reveals how cultural symbols accumulate meaning far beyond their original purpose. Most importantly, it reveals that fictional characters sometimes become arenas where competing visions of identity, growth, and continuity struggle for dominance. Mary Jane Watson became one of those arenas, not because she was designed to be, not because readers demanded it, but because her existence forced Spider-Man's mythology to confront a question that remains unresolved. Whether a story's greatest responsibility is to preserve what it once was, or to become what it has the potential to be. The most enduring conflicts in popular culture are rarely the ones that reach a definitive conclusion. They are the ones that become embedded within the structure of the story itself. Over time, the original dispute ceases to be a temporary disagreement and instead becomes part of the mythology's permanent architecture. This is ultimately what happened with Mary Jane Watson. The debate surrounding her role within Spider-Man no longer functions as a passing controversy tied to a particular creative team, editorial era, or storyline. It has become one of the defining tensions of the franchise. Every new interpretation inherits it. Every new generation encounters it. Every new creator must decide, consciously or unconsciously, how they wish to position themselves in relation to it. This permanence reveals something important about the nature of cultural myths. Myths survive not because they remain unchanged, but because they preserve a core tension capable of generating new interpretations across different eras. Spider-Man has always been a character built around competing forces: responsibility and desire, public identity and private identity, power and vulnerability, individual freedom and moral obligation. The conflict surrounding Mary Jane eventually joined that list because it came to represent another opposition embedded within the character's history. The tension between growth and preservation, between continuity and repetition, between the future and the past. Viewed from a sufficient distance, the entire controversy begins resembling a struggle over time itself. Peter Parker occupies one of the longest-running narratives in modern fiction. He has existed across generations, cultural shifts, technological revolutions, and changing audience expectations. Yet the character remains perpetually caught between movement and stasis. His history grows larger every year, while parts of the institution surrounding him continue attempting to preserve an earlier emotional state. Mary Jane became the most visible symbol of that contradiction because her relationship with Peter Parker represented the accumulated weight of time. Shared experiences, shared losses, shared victories, a future built upon a past. What makes her situation especially unique is that she achieved something few comic book characters ever accomplish. She became larger than any individual interpretation. Most supporting characters remain dependent upon particular stories or particular writers for their significance. Mary Jane gradually escaped those limitations. Her importance became distributed across decades of publication history, multiple generations of readers, and countless adaptations. As a result, attempts to diminish her role often encounter an unexpected obstacle. The audience is no longer responding merely to the character appearing in a specific comic. The audience is responding to the symbolic meaning accumulated around that character over the course of an entire cultural history. This is why the recurring efforts to reposition Mary Jane frequently produce resistance disproportionate to the stories themselves. Readers are not simply defending a romantic pairing. They are defending a particular understanding of narrative consequence. They are defending the idea that experiences should matter, that relationships should leave lasting marks, that time should produce transformation. Whether one agrees with that perspective is ultimately secondary. What matters is recognizing that the debate has evolved beyond the boundaries of ordinary fandom. It has become a disagreement about the purpose of storytelling itself. The irony is that the conflict may have ultimately strengthened Mary Jane's cultural position rather than weakened it. Characters often fade when institutions stop investing in them. Mary Jane experienced the opposite phenomenon. The repeated attempts to separate her from Peter Parker drew attention to how deeply interconnected they had become. Every effort to remove her from the center of the myth forced audiences to examine why she occupied that position in the first place. Every attempt to minimize her significance inadvertently highlighted the narrative functions she had spent decades fulfilling. The controversy transformed her from an important supporting character into one of the central symbols through which Spider-Man's history is interpreted. This helps explain why adaptations continue returning to her. Adaptations are not burdened by the same institutional history as ongoing comic book continuity. They approach the mythology from a different angle. They ask simpler questions. Who understands Peter Parker? Who complements him? Who helps define the emotional center of his world? Again and again, creators working outside the primary continuity arrive at similar conclusions. They may alter details, timelines, or personalities, but they repeatedly reconstruct the same underlying structure. The recurrence is too consistent to dismiss as nostalgia alone. It suggests that Mary Jane fulfills a role embedded deeply within the narrative logic of Spider-Man itself. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of her legacy lies elsewhere. The story of Mary Jane Watson exposes how institutions interact with their own history. Success does not always create consensus. Sometimes it creates anxiety. Sometimes a character becomes successful in ways that challenge existing assumptions. Sometimes a relationship evolves into something larger than the framework originally designed to contain it. When that happens, institutions often face a choice: adapt to the evolution or attempt to reverse it. The history of Mary Jane and Spider-Man can be read as the record of an institution struggling with precisely that decision. In symbolic terms, Mary Jane came to represent a foundation, not a destination, not a reward, and not a fantasy. A foundation. The distinction matters because foundations are often invisible while they remain intact. People notice them only when someone attempts to remove them. For decades, Mary Jane helped anchor the emotional reality of Peter Parker's world. Her presence provided continuity within a narrative defined by constant disruption. She functioned as a point of stability around which chaos could revolve. The extraordinary reaction generated by efforts to dismantle that stability revealed how much of the surrounding structure depended upon it. The final lesson of this conflict is therefore not really about Mary Jane Watson. It is about the relationship between stories and memory. Stories move forward. Memory pulls backward. Long-running myths survive by negotiating between those forces. Too much movement, and they lose their identity. Too much preservation, and they lose their vitality. Spider-Man has spent decades attempting to balance those competing pressures, and nowhere is that balancing act more visible than in the history of Mary Jane. She stands at the intersection where continuity meets nostalgia, where development meets preservation, and where the future confronts the past. That is why the debate continues. Not because the audience cannot make up its mind. Not because the character remains unresolved. The debate continues because it reflects a tension embedded within the myth itself. A tension that every generation inherits and reinterprets according to its own values. Mary Jane Watson endures because she represents one side of that tension with unusual clarity. She represents the possibility that growth matters, that time matters, that relationships matter, that a hero's journey can lead somewhere meaningful without losing the qualities that made the journey worth following in the first place. And perhaps that is the real reason her story refuses to disappear. Not because Marvel wants her at the center of Spider-Man. Not because fans demand it, but because the mythology itself keeps pulling her back toward that center. Like a foundation buried beneath a city, hidden beneath layers of construction, yet still supporting everything built above it.